Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to try not to use the mic. If you guys have problems hearing me, then I'll switch to the mic. Thomas Laszlo, Canadian-born, from Hungarian parents, worked in Hungary. Now I'm working in the U.S. and working on that green card that everyone tries to get. I think they'll let me in. The FBI checked me out, took blood, did my fingerprints, and everything's clear, which is good. If you do Google my name, though, and put in Hungary and put Thomas Laszlo, which is my full name, I didn't discover it, but one of my coworkers did about 2 years ago. There's a gay porn actor named Thomas Laszlo. I'm not built for porn. It isn't me. It isn't me. So I was born in Guelph, Ontario. Corning University is very famous for their agricultural program. I would say Guelph, Ontario is the premier agricultural college in Canada. Certainly we did a lot of exchange work with Corning. When I went to school at that time, there was not a set viticultural program as there is now at Corning and at Brock and St. Catharines. Pardon me?
Cornell, not Corning.
Okay, I live in Corning, all right? Take Tim Martinson out anyways. He works for the state now. Agricultural background and basically agronomy. Worked in animal husbandry. Cattle, horses, and saw pretty quickly that industry was dying in Ontario and certainly too cost intensive to get into. And I was married during college, so I didn't experience any of the wild college life, and I don't have any good stories about sexual escapades or STDs or anything like that. I was clean guy. Anyways, she was a real inspiration for me. She was in a horticulture program, and she organized a trip down to Chateau des Charmes, which is one of the founding vinifera guys in Ontario and the Niagara Peninsula. And she introduced me to wine. Really, I was buying cheap Hungarian stuff, and she was buying this VQA Ontario wine. And I saw a future in that. So when I graduated, I went to work in the vineyards. Up there, their labor is mostly offshore, but they bring in Jamaican crews or Mexican crews, and they set you up for 7 months. The farmer will give you accommodations, pay for your plane ticket. And I was working with these Jamaicans in the vineyard, and they'd sing spirituals and stuff like that. It was kind of cool, but I was like the outsider. And after a month working with them, I asked them, so what language do you guys speak? And the guy goes, English, man. And I was like, wow, okay. And I'm pretty good at accents. It's a very multicultural country, Canada, but Jamaican is pretty tough. I guess it depends on what state of mind you're in. Worked in the vineyards, found out that was hard work. Didn't mind it though. Henry of Pelham is a pretty good family estate winery. I'm making some of the top wine in Ontario. They brought me on as their vineyard manager, and then that harvest they pulled me in to the winery, and I stayed in the winery ever since, but I've always been involved in the viticultural end. Worked about 4 years in Ontario, did all the ice wine stuff. Which kind of sucks if you're a winemaker in Ontario. You have 2 harvests. You can do 300 tons fresh, and you could do 200 tons for ice wine, because those guys are making millions of bottles of ice wine a year. So it's really difficult to be a winemaker if you're working 2 harvests. So my story for getting into Europe, I was getting into sweet wines, noble sweet wines. Being born in Ontario with the whole French-Quebec thing, you're forced to learn French. In middle school, and it was kind of like my parents learning Russian under the Soviets in Hungary. You don't really want to learn a language that is forced on you. And there's always that tension between Ontario and Quebec. You know, they almost seceded from us 1% away, and then they were going to join you guys. And I don't know if you know about that, but they're going to use their dollar. And it's like, it never happened, which their economy would have been destroyed, right? There's an article in the Wine Spectator by Per Henrik Manson, or something like that, in 1995, talking about foreign investment in Tokaj. After the wall fell in 1990, a lot of foreign investors came in. The good communists, the higher-ups in the Communist Party, had a lot of land that was owned by them and factories. Well, not owned by them, but they controlled it. And they bought it for dirt cheap as soon as the government changed, and you had wild capitalism at that point. So the vineyards of Tokaj were really run down. I was raised on Hungarian wine. My father grew up with a vineyard. They had a trucking company in Hungary, but all the trucks went to World War I, then World War II, and one truck came back with 3 wheels. I mean, that was it. And they basically had a 5-acre farm growing Surka Barat, which is Pinot Gris, and Kuva Dinka, which is a local variety. So I wouldn't say there's winemaking in my blood, because I always drank the cheap stuff, but there was a winemaking tradition. And part of the Hungarian national anthem has the golden nectar of Tokaj in it. So reading about all these Bordelais and Hugh Johnson and all these guys, say Vega Sicilia going into Tokaj and raping the land and changing the style of Tokaj, it was very infuriating. So I got on a plane in 1996 and went over there. I always offend French-oriented people. I love French people. I get along with them great. I love to disagree. But basically, I read this article, and I go, I got to go over there and see what those French bastards are doing, right? And what I found was they were great. I mean, they took the money. They had Hungarian people, which are very skilled in viticulture, and they put the necessary capital into that area and really worked with the locals. And we were in the following year, I was hired as technical director at Chateau Pajzos and Chateau Megyer, 2 of the main estates, and I stayed there for 5 years. There was a real renaissance in Tokaj and a real improvement in quality. Marketing has kind of failed, so world dominance, or not dominance, or presence is kind of lacking right now. But yeah, the foreigners were great. The owners of Pajzos were also the owners of Chateau Clinet and Pomerol. So I spent a lot of time with Michel Roland and Jean-Michel Arcote, tasting the Pomerol. So it's kind of nice to taste these Merlot wines and compare a little bit. What brought me to the Finger Lakes, Fox Run, pretty good known winery. Peter Bell and the owner Scott Osborne were in Tokaj on a fact-finding mission and setting up wine trails. It was a U.S.-backed trade consortium thing, and they were talking through translators on how to set up a wine trail. And so they visited me in 1998, and I kept up the connections. And then when my daughter was born, Ava, in 2001, I had to make the decision whether I raised her in Hungary or North America. Came back to North America, contacted Scott, and Heron Hill was in the process of hiring, and I started in 2002 at Heron Hill. So this is my 7th vintage coming up. So that gives me a little background, because I'm not sure the rest of my speech is that long, so I was going to just suck up some time with telling you who I am. Who has terroir and how do I get it? Terroir, there is no written book on this yet. And if I deal with writers or sommeliers and they have a preconceived notion of what terroir is, I'm going to tell them what they want to know about terroir. I might not agree with it, but at the end of the day, I want to sell wine. So, I mean, the buyer is correct, And I'm going to try to figure out a little bit in the Finger Lakes a distinction between terroir that can be made from a certain style and a certain soil versus mineral-driven, structured wines that only are able to be produced on certain select lands. We don't have 200, 300-year history of documentation of our vineyards, so we don't really know every little plot that will produce these mineral-structured, world-class Grand Cru type Rieslings. But I'm fortunate enough to work with two of them. One of the vineyards is the owner's vineyard, John Engel. Started growing vinifera in 1972. Had no help from Constantine Frank at all. I don't think anybody really did, and John's pretty hard-headed. So he kind of learned from the school of hard knocks, but got a great vineyard and kind of an organic perspective. And then Heron Hill was planted in 1968, which I'm slowly having to remove those vines because they're not producing, with Riesling. So one of the oldest Riesling vineyards in North America. And you'll taste at the panel my estate, and you'll taste today John's estate, drier Rieslings. So let's get on with the talk. When the Earth scratches us back with a glacier, I really think it's important that we look at what causes vinifera grapes, which is in the minority, maybe 5% of what's grown in the Finger Lakes. Most of it's juice grapes, varieties that are not allowed to be made into wine in Europe or Canada, but support a lot of families and are made into wine in our area. But we have some great potential for Riesling. But what really modifies, what I believe really modifies the area to allow us to do this is Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario, Rochester's around here. It's about 2 hours to the top of these lakes. That lake is huge. It's 7,500 square miles in surface area. These little Finger Lakes, even the bigger ones, are like 24 square miles. So I view Lake Ontario as the main boiler, and these 11 Finger Lakes as the space heaters that kind of modify the little microclimates. There's only really 5 major viticultural lakes. It'd be Canandaigua, Cuca, the Y Lake, the Crooked Lake, Seneca, Cayuga. There's a brave soul on Skinny Atlas that is growing vinifera. So, glacier. I think Gunther might have talked about the glacial period. Soil is very old in Europe. Here, not so old. My facts aren't 100%. They're kind of generalized. But the glacial period that last affected our area was started in 70,000 years ago approximately. And about 10,000 years ago, it started to recede. It was known as a Laurentide ice shield. It was about 1.5 miles thick during that time period. The Finger Lakes were river valleys, so they were kind of drainage areas. They are quite deep lakes, and when I say the glacier scratched its back, it really does kind of look like that. And what happened with this last glacial period is that the glacier dug out those river valleys even more, and then as it was receding, it dropped off a lot of sediment and sealed those lakes off, made them landlocked, and consequently, they're some of the deepest lakes in America, up to 400 plus feet deep. The 4 elements, a little oriental shift on it. We're going to look at terroir and an interpretation that I'd like to share with you today. Again, I could be with Stephen Brook or something, and I will talk to him about his interpretation of terroir and how he wants to hear it from me. Sometimes not. Air, very important. Climate is quite important. Temperature, we are in the northern growing zone. For sure, we're cool climate. Carnero says they're cool climate. That's bullshit. They're not cool climate, man. You go out there and the Pinot Noir is 28 bricks. I mean, what the hell's cool climate about that? 2006, I made red wine from 18 bricks and 12 acid. That's cool climate. So this is gotta go back. Now I really messed up here. Okay, here. A view from part of John's vineyard on Engel, or the Engel Vineyard. He's the owner as well of Heron Hill. Only guy growing vinifera on Canandaigua Lake. Most of them are juice growers, and he has 20 acres. This mountain is steep. It's not Mosel steep, but it's pretty steep. And I've always tried to tell them, get some investors and cut out 500 acres and put in Riesling there, because some of the slopes are going totally south. And he says he's too old for that. Bummer. So anybody that's rich and really wants to do something pretty intense, I think you have an opportunity. You can talk to me later. We're not as pristine about our vineyards. Vineyards look immaculate in a lot of places of the world, and you can make some damn good wine everywhere. In the Finger Lakes, we got twisted posts, we got some weeds, and I had a German guy from the Czar winemaker came. First thing he said when he came in, he said, you know, how come your vineyards look so shitty? And I go, well, because they make good wine. And he goes, I spend so much money going 8 times through the vineyard. And then he tasted the wine, and at the end of it, he was going, how can you make wine like this in North America? I'm coming into this market with my wine, and I thought I would just blow away the market, and you're making better stuff than me. I go, well, you know, Terroir, I mean, Grand Cru sites, they exist everywhere. Then he asked me, how can he cut back on his labor costs? This is a shot of the bluff from Heron Hill Winery. It's called the Bluff. Oh, I gotta get used to this. Keuka Lake's very picturesque, and in Canandaigua, they're the most kind of mountainous. It splits in a Y here. There's grapes on the east and the west side. Dr. Frank is on the east side. Heron Hill is, Bully Hill is, and there's a few wineries on the west side. Our neighbors, right here, that's not my vineyard. That's Elvira. How many people know Elvira? And not late night Elvira, you know, no. It's the grape variety. Okay, so we are a cool climate, typically cold, snowy winters, short spring and fall. Lately, the spring and falls don't even seem to exist. It's really cold and really hot, and then really hot and really cold. But we still have cool enough harvest that we don't burn off all the monoterpenes, all the floral aromatics, the acidity, the pHs are still relatively low because of that cooler harvest. But we have a very compact growing season, so we need pretty high heat units during the main growing season, which would be June, July, August. Average growing degree days, we don't really have to translate that or anything. Average in Finger Lakes is 2,700 based on the last 30 years. Germany never used to be 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit growing degree days, but they are now. They even have some that are even higher. Burgundy and Oregon are traditionally around that, but everyone's higher now. Within the last decade, those degree days in the Finger Lakes have reached between 2,900 and 3,200. Sonoma can be at 3,200. And that was, in the last decade, 6 vintages had those really high temperatures in the growing season. In the prior 2 decades to the one I'm talking about, there was only 4 vintages which exceeded 2,900, and none were over 3,000 degree growing days. Global warming, cyclical, I don't know, but it's something that is certainly on everyone's mind, and it makes for very erratic, difficult grape growing. This year, we broke bud in end of May. We're supposed to be dormant until basically we broke bud at the beginning of May. Usually we break it at the end of May. We had 3 weeks in April that were between 70 and 85 degrees, and the grapes came out of dormancy, and they shouldn't have because we got nailed with frosts. Luckily, not everybody got nailed, but certainly it could have been a real disaster and wiped everyone out. Not for you got to be very hardy. It's not for the weak at heart and weak in pocketbook too to work in the Finger Lakes. So once again, water. Remembering Lake Ontario is up there, and it really does affect the climate, both in the Niagara region and for us. Canandaigua Lake, nice lake. Some of the most expensive lake property in the USA is on Canandaigua Lake. Wegmans live on Canandaigua Lake, from the Wegmans grocery chain. No grapes are growing on that side, which is the west side, but there's aspects that are totally facing south with really good air drainage. Heron Hill, most lakes are around 700 feet above sea level, and it depends on how high you up. It's kind of deceiving, but it can be quite some distance from the bottom of that lake to the top. So we're at 1,400 feet above sea level. So we're 700 feet higher than the town of Hammondsport, which is close to us. Sorry. Okay, that's. Unfortunately, this acre was 4-acre plot was ripped out. That was a 1968 planting, but it got down to a 1/4 ton per acre and just not profitable at all. So I've started replanting. That's a 3-year-old planting, and that picture was about a month ago. We're north facing, which was very difficult in cool years, and I declassify a lot of my stuff. In warm years, it's like the czar. I get really high ripeness with low pH and high acid, and it makes for real Vin de Garde wines that age. Heron Hill, the Heron, art shot. This is one of my art shots. It's owner's property there. So a little graph just to show how significant Lake Ontario is. There it is. That's the surface area. And the max depth is up to 1,000 feet. And then you'll see how much different these little space heater lakes, as I like to call them. Earth, terroir, soil. This is how it was formed. We have soils that are very different from Ontario. Those are very fertile, lake bed, calcareous soils. We are based mostly on shale, and there's differences. There's calcareous shale and there's non-calcareous shale. And outside the Moselle, I really haven't seen soils like this that are just so broken up layers of rock. If you see the different layers here. This is how reforestation and the soils formed, starting 10,000 years ago. The forest came up, then you have dendritis, you have the forest leaves dying, and you get little soil particles, acid rains break up the shale material, and you start to get minerals. And basically, we have a clay topsoil at Heron Hill, but very shallow. Very quickly, you get into these big blocks of shale. And just like the Moselle, these roots, these aren't vine roots because I couldn't excavate my vineyard like Gunther did. But you can see roots going down and busting up the shale, and our vineyards certainly do that. On special sites, we have sites in the Finger Lakes that are very deep soils and quite fertile. So this is Heron Hill. This is just showing you more of the erosion and soil development that's continuing to develop now. And you can see how those roots are busting up the shale. And we remove that every year, so it's quite amazing how quickly it forms. Water, very important to forming the soils, wearing down the rocks and the minerals. This is at Ingle Vineyard. He's on a Howard loam soil. He picked that soil by chance. He was a hippie guy. He got a one-room shack with no running water. He rebelled against his parents. He went to Winterland in California in the 60s. Jimi Hendrix spit on him. And I mean, he had the whole thing going, and he came back, and his parents had cut him off from money because he was wild and crazy, and he got a chunk of land quite cheap, and it turned out to be really good grape growing land. and now he's transformed from being a hippie into capitalist. I think that happens to most people, right, with age. But he has not just broken up shale, you know, he's got some big fieldstone and stuff and more loamy soil, but still pretty low pHs, which I'll get into. Okay, yeah, sure, I'm talking to the screen. So yeah, again at Heron Hill, this is what my soils come from, broken up shale of all different colors. Some really big pieces too. I put that together. Actually, that was an art shot. This is all shale. It didn't really come out the color, but we're laying fallow that field to buckwheat, and then probably next year sorghum or something to suck out the nematodes because it's been in grape production for so long. All right, I think we covered that. Thin soils, 4 to 12 inches on less fertile sites. Seneca and Cayuga have some deposits of topsoil that are quite thick and therefore more vigorous soils, and they make a different style of wine. If you're on calcareous shale, you can have pHs of 7, which is neutral, and a lot of people lime their soils up to get to 7, and it's great for high yields and stuff, but you also get a lot of potassium pickup in your grapes, which results in a high pH, and you don't get the right cation exchange capacity happening to pick up those minerals. Slate and shale just don't jump into little vines and work their way up, and just because you have shale doesn't mean it's going to taste like that in the grapes. It's all on a microscopic scale, depending on your soil pHs and the composition as to whether or not you'll have something that will express itself as mineral in the wines at a later date. Natural drainage is pretty common in the Finger Lakes. Fire. I didn't have any good shots of the sun, so I got chickens. But there's sun there. The owner still grows his own food, does fly by jet, but he grows his own food. He has an organic garden. These are his prize chickens. Old Glory, gotta love it, man, It's great. Great old barn, a lot of history there. His barn, see, our old maps in Hungary and everything, they'd be great. They'd be all sketched out, 200 years old. In 200 years' time, this is what geologists and archaeologists are going to see for our map for Grand Cru. These balloons and stuff, and they're going to go, wow, man, that's real terroir there. John's organic garden. So part of my talk is about what does the man do that makes a difference with his vineyard and his wines. So he's got this whole organic garden thing. He's got a lifestyle going, and that's transmitted through his wines, I believe. So there's a lot of biodiversity on his property. Pretty hot summers, so we do have to do some mildew control. Both his farm and my farm, absolutely no herbicides, no chemical fertilizers. We don't even really use fertilizers. We don't use any insecticide, herbicide, and we stay away from lime, which isn't always the most economical thing to do, but it makes the wines that we want to make. Since I've been here, we've had record high temperatures and lows all at the wrong time. We've had devastation, complete wipeout of not harvesting a grape in 2005. We've had hails, storms that never used to occur. We had record snowfalls. We've had really cold vintages, followed by really hot November and December, making it very difficult to make ice wine. Germany's having a tough time making ice wine. And, it might be a thing of the past if you're not throwing it in a freezer box, which you're not supposed to, according to TTB regulation 836 or something in 2004. Thank the Canadians for that. Some trade agreement on wheat, they probably said, okay, we're going to give you a wheat subsidy, but you got to enforce those laws on ice wine that can only be made on the vine. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, Canada, but you guys also grow Vidal, which grows 10 tons to the acre, and Germany can't make ice wine out of that. So, you know, you kind of make your own rules up as you go along. And what's great about America is it's free. I mean, that's why you come here. European winemakers love coming here because they're not held back by these rules of protectionism that the ice wine industry is doing, and they harvest by machine up there now, and that's something you won't see Inniskill and advertising on the back of their magazine. You got to do something if you're making 1 million cases a year, right? I don't know if they'll let me back in Canada. I've been out of Canada for 13 years. The fifth element, John Ingle, John Rogers, vineyard manager guy. John Roger, good guy. He actually played hockey. John Ingle coached hockey, and he's been working that vineyard for 20 years since he was 10 years old, even just doing little stuff. And that's John's son-in-law. Good patriot, served in the Army in Desert Storm. Really happy to be where he's at now. Vineyard crew, 3-year-old vines. That guy's actually here, right there. They look happy, don't they? I treat my people well. A couple compliments is sometimes worth more than 50 cents an hour raise. I learned that somewhere. Terry, our vineyard manager, this is why we don't have to use herbicides, no ground post-emergent or soil sterilizing stuff. It's all done with that Braun takeout plow. Best takeout plow available. You got a knife on it, you got stakes, it trip wires. We can take out 85% of our weeds, plus we have to hill up in the winter, and it's all done with cultivation. So, me. Hey, the Grateful Dead, Jerry. Fucking A. I got to know the United States by touring the Dead. My first show was in Buffalo in '86 with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty. What a trip. July 4th. I don't know how I got in Lackawanna with fireworks, but it was weird. They took me all around this great country and introduced me to some wonderful people from California to Minnesota to Virginia, all over everywhere. And I think what forms a man too, which forms his food, if you see a chef or whatever, is kind of his background and his philosophy. And America doesn't just give me great Rieslings and great friendships, but it almost was a lifestyle. And sorry to see it go. We have the ability to impact severely what we do in the vineyard or in the cellar. Basic process for winemaking hasn't changed. Process Canadian, process American. I'm working on it. My name can be Thomas or Thomas. I'm trying to work it in. It's not Long Island accent though. That's upstate. Really hasn't changed in 5,000 years, 90% of it. We've just gotten a little bit more analytical and fussy. Big question, does the character of the man change the wine, or does the character of the wine change the man? I met a man yesterday that says he doesn't give a shit about what anybody thinks. He makes the wine, and the owner says, good. And he can't say anything else because that's what that guy does, and I have great respect for that. I'm caught in the middle. The wines you're going to taste today are wines that are my interpretation. If they're from Ingle Vineyard, they're working through whatever magic John brings from his soils, a little bit of the man, the intuitive side, not the scientific side, the side that makes that guy's 10 chefs, similar ingredients, similar, whatever, taste 10 different flavors, right? Well, I believe that there's an extension of the mind that some type, or the spirit that goes into the wine, and I'm allowed that with a certain amount of wines in our portfolio. But the wine does change the character of the man somewhat in that I have wines that I don't necessarily drink. They're all really good, but they're to a buying public that needs to have an introduction to a certain level of wine before they get to a wine that is my interpretation, which is okay. The Tao of Riesling. If you can't grow corn on it, perfect. Really. Can't grow corn on that. That's John Ingles' vineyard. See, the trellis, I mean, it's all funky. It's not manicured and straight. And you'll taste the Riesling from it. I don't think it's lacking. Multiple trunks. You don't have to worry about it in warmer areas. We get crown gall, we get knocked back, sometimes right to the floor. We have to bring up suckers. So our vines never really look that pretty. It's from our cold winters and our late frosts. This is a planting in 1968. These are like the oldest planting at Heron Hill, Riesling. And you can see a lot of stunted shoots and row middles that haven't been touched in 20 years. I don't dare touch them now because they're kind of like in senility, and it's like changing medication on them. They probably die pretty quick. But we do got a birdhouse there. Okay, birdhouse right there. I'll probably have to rip this out because this year, if I get a third of a ton per acre, that'll be it. Very concentrated little berries, but it's a pain in the ass to pick them. You have to pick 1,000 feet to get a box. Not economical winemaking or grape growing. That's the soils that I'm dealing in row at Heron Hill. New planting, probably the highest density in Riesling in the Finger Lakes, maybe the East Coast. 2.5-foot spacing by 8 feet. 10114 rootstock doesn't really mean much other than it's a low vigor rootstock. I have a very low vigor site, and clone 90, that's in its third year. It got nailed with frost, so I got a lot of secondaries. Then it got nailed with hail, and then rain and cold during bloom, so I got shatter. So all the good things that make the Finger Lakes profitable. Many Riesling vineyards in the Finger Lakes and throughout the world will not be what you consider Grand Cru. They're not going to be like Clos St. Hoon or Velner Zonenur, where you could pick up that mineral, whatever structure every year, despite the vintage. That's not going to happen everywhere. Some vineyards are growing on corn land. That's okay. They need to make a living too, those guys. What I've seen is low tonnage, low input grape growing produces more interesting wines to me, but that is also very specific on the site. And we're talking pHs of soils of 5 and 6. Very not conducive to vigorous, big crop grape growing. I think we went through this. A lot of people would be pissed off at me here. Immaculate, over-manipulated, spotless, sterile vineyards produce simple wines. It's bad. I'm not saying they're sterile vineyards here, because I think the reds benefit more from what you're doing with canopy management, but the whites, I'm not so sure if they need that much sun and finickiness, but that's could be disputed, I guess, later on with me. Okay. Go up to 10 grams, but you'd never really notice it as being a sweet wine. I like the TAs to hang around there, and you will taste this wine today as a 2.68 pH finished pH wine, which you don't see that too many places in the world. And the 2002 of this vintage is still crystal white and, still not ready to drink, really. Many vineyards won't produce these numbers, and we got to work with that Riesling too, and we can make some nice wines for more of a mass populace. If that variety doesn't work, plant Cabernet Franc. If you know the situation in the Finger Lakes, you know not to plant Cabernet Franc. Vastly, vastly overplanted. Don't plant without a contract. Terroir 1, this is a terroir. Early drinking, fruity, sweety, simple and user-friendly. Often guys are 4 to 6 tons per acre. Washington 7 to 8, no problem. And if the canopy can bear it, it's fine. You can make great Riesling at 17 bricks. Well, not great, but fruity Riesling, acceptable. You harvest in the middle of October. Usually it's always machine picked. There's a little skin contact on it. They go for, okay, this is not really my winemaking, it's just kind of generalized in this style of wine. Super clean juice, really cold, long, stressed fermentations that produces isoamyl acetate and all those banana esters and fruit salads and stuff, which don't really show much of the structure anymore, showing the structure of the yeast. So no ester enhancing yeast for me, but you can use that. Very reductive, use the dry ice, CO2 everything, ferment between 50 and 60 degrees, ferment for 30 days, have it stick on you, and that's why it's semi-sweet, I don't know. Use Epernay too, guaranteed you're gonna make this style. It's like the worst yeast ever. And people hate me for saying that, but it just produces all these esters, and it always sticks on people, and just not my cup of tea for Riesling. No lees work. Separation after fermentation, separate it within a week, sulfur it, bottle it in January and February, get primary aromas. No concept of what it's going to be like in 2 to 3 years, but it's going to be down people's gullet, and it doesn't matter. So they're just making it for competitions for that year and to get as much fruit bomb in the bottle as possible, and that's great. And people love that style, and we can make it, and it's $13 a bottle and sell it all day long. But you have to drink it within 16 months, because those primary aromas, once they're gone and you don't have structure behind it, that's a dead wine. Riesling aging is a misnomer. It only ages if it's properly treated in the vineyard and in the cellar. Terroir 2, more of what I'm doing here with these two wines. Low crop level, just because the soil site won't do any more than that. Working with old vines are probably better, more significant with red grape varieties, but we do see a little difference just because they produce smaller berries, and I don't know, the sommeliers and writers like to hear old vines. Hey. Okay. Whole cluster pressing. I do it most of the time with the smaller stuff, lot stuff, the Grand Cru type things. And it's cloudy, the juice. There's some racking, but when you whole bunch press, you don't get a lot of solids. Go for about 120 NTU on the turbidity scale. That gives a little bit more flavor and nutrients, so when it's fermenting, as long as you're giving it air, it won't reduce on you. I go for a warm, short fermentation, lots of air, neutral yeast. I'm using DV10s, EC 11118s. I'm not using anything that enhances. I will ferment to dryness up to 68 degrees Fahrenheit in 7 to 9 days. I learned this in Hungary with Tokaj. We would ferment in barrels. We'd start with 3 alcohol after the maceration, 400 grams of sugar, and within 2 weeks it would be fermented to 11 alcohol, 12 alcohol. Vigorous fermentations are good if you have good fruit to work with. Chateau Yquem, people told me sometimes 2 days it would ferment in barrels. So this misnomer, long stress fermentation, it works if you have the right indigenous yeast and it's 500 years old and it's selected out. New World, we don't really have those yeasts that have been in that vineyard and in that cellar for that long. So when we do indigenous yeast fermentations here, it's almost always going to be bad. You're going to have vinegar and all kinds of other crap going on. I will leave the wines that you'll try today, the Grand Cru stuff, on Growly. So no racking of it. As it's starts to near the end of its fermentation, I'll start turning it over. And that's really important because if you don't do that, it will reduce on you on that heavy lees. But if you start it at the right time, and I'll turn it over 2, 3, 4 times as it's needed, and then it'll level out. And then I chill the tank down, no malolactic, and it will sit on grow lees for, I'm just bottling now my Ingo Vineyard Riesling, on full grow lees with no sulfur. So I've taken it to the point where it's almost aldehydic. And then when I take it out, I whack it with sulfur, just take it totally other way. And it's a bit of a Germanic technique. But you will take something that's oxidized, smells like latex paint, and you will get the most incredible, fruit and texture. It's really quite unbelievable. But it's very scary winemaking. You really have to know what you're doing here. It takes a lot of balls to do something like this, and that's why you have to have your $13 wines. There's no room for errors in winemaking. You can't screw up anything. It's like a dentist. I mean, don't screw up. $25 to $35 a bottle is what we like to see, even higher for the wines, the 2 wines you'll taste from me today. Terroir 3, if you are on a cornfield and you have high tonnage and that's just what your canopy wants to do, you try cluster thinning it, you get bullwood, so you need to have a higher tonnage. That's good, and you can make that fruity wine and release it early, get your medals and everything else. Or you can harvest later than the guys winning gold medals with 5-month-old wines. That's your start, okay? I got an overly vigorous vineyard, and it's not going to make really Grand Cru wine in terms of mineral flavor, but I can take it to the length with oxygen, not sulfuring too early, work in the lees as long as it can handle. Usually it can't handle as much as an older vineyard or a more higher Grand Cru site, but you can build in mid-palate structure and de-emphasize those primary fruits a bit. And the mineral tones are one type of terroir. You can also build a quite structured full Riesling that's ageable from what's normally made into more of a populist, high-volume style. To classify, we got over 40 varieties in the Finger Lakes, many Labrusca are hybrid. Can we classify? I don't know. Riesling's only 5% of the vineyards maybe. Natives are very profitable. Well, not so much anymore, but the people that make Red Cat and native wines and are getting huge profit margins on them, what do you tell them? To rip it out and plant Riesling? No, you devastate the economy. So somehow we have to extract Riesling out of the picture, maybe get a classification system on that, and let everybody else make in foxy wines and sweet wines to make their money and enjoy life, and the two just have to go in different directions. It's always sticky. The QMP is reinventing itself, the File de Pay, the DOCs. I mean, they're all very confusing, and that's not necessarily what we need as another AVA. I don't know what the answer is. It's not something I'm going to work on. Not the best accurate numbers here, but it's hard to get really up to date. What you will see here is Ontario, much more vinifera than it's planted here, actually, in Ontario. Finger Lakes, 543 acres. Out of this 80,000 that I've portrayed, which is not every country, we represent 0.67% of production of Riesling. I mean, what is that, man? Like, it's nothing. But that 0.67% matters if you're only selling to 0.1% of the population, and that's what I'm after. That's the geek that wants to know all about it and is into Riesling. And if that 1.1% buys it, I can sell it at a high price, and there will be more demand than supply. What's this? Has anybody seen this? This is at the tank bottom of a Cabernet Franc 2005 from Ingo Vineyard that was at the bottom of the tank when I drained it. And it's like coral. It's tartrates and it's like wine's living. I mean, it made art for me, and I didn't even know it was doing it. I mean, like, how psychedelic is that? Look at it. Like coral reef and stuff, and these are all tubules, and amazing. So we can pour the wine. I'm pretty much done talking, so let's get the feedback on what I've said and who I've offended. Hey, you remember when Bush was in Canada and he thanked all those people for, during 9/11, a lot of Canadians let American planes land, and he didn't go to Canada like for 5 years, and he's out like in the West Coast or East Coast, and everybody's going like this to Bush, right? And he's a funny guy, right? So next day he goes, yeah, I don't know, what type of gesture of thanks that the Canadians give, but I was sure getting a lot of it. So that was cool. That was cool. So I didn't see anybody doing this to me, so I guess I'm all right.
Do you want us to tell us anything specific about the
Quickly, 2005 was a disaster vintage in terms of grape production. We had massive winter kill. Some people lost their vineyards. Most guys with vinifera grew 1/2 ton per acre. This is 1/2 ton per acre stuff. Generally, Ingle Vineyard, we try to do 2.5. That said, I mean, it's not more concentrated necessarily than our normal cropping level. It was a drought year, so only the sites that are cooler and with more clay could really survive without irrigation. Relatively slow, small production on it. I talked about the extended grow lee aging. This wine is 12.5 alcohol, pH of 2.68 naturally. I don't add any acid. That vineyard always produces that. Most people can't think you can ferment at that pH.
Thomas, the other interesting thing that I'd love to hear you talk about is there's always a great debate about, and I really appreciate your mineral-driven terroir, Grand Cru style. So what is mineral for you? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Chablis used to be called mineral when they added 120 parts free sulfur to their wines. And that smells flinty. They don't do that anymore. So there's a mineral. You added sulfur and it came out as flintiness. That's really not what we're looking at here. I pick up what I'd say is crushed granite with Ingle Vineyard. Never, when it goes into bottle, it's always pretty fruity. With extended bottle age, the mineral comes out and the fruit is de-emphasized. You get the secondary flavors, and it really is. I've done this. I've ground up granite and I've put in blue stones and stuff in a very mild wine, Thompson Seedless or something, and let it sit overnight, and you can actually smell some mineral extraction. It doesn't mean because you have blue slate, it's going to smell like blue slate. It's going to smell like some type of rock or something in there, but it's all on a really microscopic level that these mineral flavors come out, and they're most expressed in white wines, and they are expressed with age. Usually when I show this wine with a bunch of other Finger Lake wines, they're going, wow, man, you got really good fruity wines, good acid backbone, and they go, what's wrong with this? I go, well, I don't know. I mean, what's wrong with this? I got a lot of people on the other end, at the higher echelon of the wine writer world, that are praising this wine and giving me, 90 points and stuff. But this is not the norm. This is not about fruit in this wine. There's a little bit of lime, and there's just this stony character. It's not a reduction. It's just really kind of hard to describe. And some people are so used to young, fruity wines that they don't even get to experience wines that express a secondary flavor, which I'm saying is mineral. But for me and Sean, we've kind of said this is more of a crushed red granite, if you want to get specific.
We have some questions. Yeah. Can you serve this wine with chicken?
He's my assistant winemaker. Yeah, I made a good impression at Finger Lakes fire and ice or something, wine on ice in Elmira. I was kind of new. I was feeling a little bit jilted and just, I had a little vodka problem. I don't drink anymore, really. I mean, I taste wine, but coming from Eastern Europe, you're not an alcoholic unless you're penniless and laying in your own vomit on the street. I mean, you could drink a lot in Europe, right? And we drank a lot in Europe. So I kind of had to, I was there and, you know, I'm not usually an asshole, but I guess I was that day. And I was going up to people. And my classic line is, when people are really, oh, I got my stuff together, I'm real pumped in circumstances, like, what wine goes good with cigarettes? That's what you got to ask him. And you know what the answer is? The most expensive wine.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thomas, with such a low pH, are you adding as much sulfur as you would to another wine, or do you, with such a low pH, you might?
I drive it up to 50 free for sure at bottling, but you're not going to drink that in the next year. I mean, these wines are meant for long time, and you know, I learned from the guys in Germany, Lozen and stuff. He would have a BA that would taste totally oxidized brown juice. I go, Ernie, what the hell are you going to do with this? And he goes, that's okay, Thomas, you'll see. At bottling, he hits it with 350 parts, and he gets 70 free. Otherwise, if you add it slowly along, you won't get any binding of the sulfur. And so that's with all this grow lean management. When I transfer it over from kind of the oxidation point, I hit it pretty hard with sulfur, and I like sulfur, and it's going to work on this style wine. You're going to release it 6 months after bottling. You can't use this amount of sulfur. Right now, you're probably tasting about 30 free. It does go down in about 2 years, but I bottled this year's at 2.9 pH with 55 free.
Another question? Yeah.
What are the differences between how you made Riesling in the Niagara Peninsula and how you make it in the Finger Lakes in terms of the vineyard and winemaking in general?
Who makes Riesling in Long Island? Niagara Peninsula, their problem is they got Weiss 21B, which is a good Moselle clone. Herman Weiss from St. Urbanshof bought into Vineland Estates way back, and he's a nurseryman, and he just coated the whole Ontario with Weiss 21B. Very prolific grape, grows a lot. Not the best suited for vigorous soils, but it's okay for slate soils in the Moselle. We got nice Geisenheim clones, 239 and 90, which are much better for Riesling, I think. And the problem with Ontario, for the most part, is high pHs. They got calcareous soils. They have a climate that's too hot. They can ripen Merlot up to 24 bricks. In old Niagara-on-the-Lake, the Riesling will be burnt off. It'll just be peachy because it gets up to 22 bricks with 3.5 pH. None of the Rieslings that I've tasted age, nor do the ice wines age. And that's really because they're picking with high pHs and kind of overripe fruit with too much sun exposure. What we're doing in the Finger Lakes, and there's other places. Atwater has some nice stuff on Seneca Lake. There are pockets all throughout these lakes that are yet to be discovered that will make these Grand Cru Riesling terroir wines. But this is it for North America, not just America. This is North America. I mean, we are at 0.67% of the production. But
Yeah.
we're the dope.
Russell.
Hi, Russell. Yeah, you know, Dr. Frank's put in 40 acres. John Wagner's put in 40 acres, and it's good. And you know, we have to get wines at $13 out, and they don't have to be necessarily as sweet as they are, but we do have to have some sweetness, and that's okay. The wines I showed you here are a style that I think will not be a Schmaragd from Austria, will not be a Rheingau. This is a Grand Cru interpretation of what I think we can make, which is a higher alcohol, you know, wine. And the more Riesling that's planted, the better. I just read St. Michel makes 650,000 cases. Eroica's now at 40,000 cases. And we could just speak with our voice. People like me come out and you know, throw some controversy out there because I don't have the volumes to buy ads in magazines or anything like that. So we really just have to like knock on doors and say we exist. And the whole Riesling movement as a whole will help us because we can't fund it with our small amount of acreage. So the more that's planted, the more that people get it in their mouths, the more adventurous they'll get, and they will start to seek out different ones. So yeah, we should plant it. Forget about Cab Franc. That's over in the Finger Lakes.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay.